radicalization of youth. It's going to mostly be Muslim youth, okay? Although I want to say a little bit about radicalization of youth in general, but it's going to be mostly about Muslim youth. And the most important points that I want to make are really these. That young people, young Muslims, mostly men, at the university where I work, 2 Muslim students have gone to Syria to join ISIS, a woman and a young man. And I believe that many of the things that are said about radicalization of youth are not accurate. I believe, based on the little research that I've done, that people, young people, are attracted to extremist groups that sometimes are violent, largely through relationships, friendships in institutions like Kenyatta University. Who you know, who you spend your time with plays a great deal, makes a great deal of difference in whether you are attracted to extremist groups. And the more religious you are, the more you follow Islamic practice and the prayers and fasting and so forth, the less likely you are to join an extremist or terrorist group. If you are really a practicing Muslim, the evidence, if you spend your time in the ordinary mosque or with ordinary Muslims, the prayers, like at Kenyatta University, it's less likely that you will become an extremist and a radical than if you did something else, okay? So you can see the connection between religious observance and extremism is not strong. In fact, many of the young people in Kenya who were identified as extremists and terrorists were not well schooled in Islam. I can't remember his name, but the young man who was identified as Abdi Rahman something, I don't remember his name, as the mastermind of the killing in Garissa. He was not poor, all right? His father was a chief someplace up near Garissa, I forget where. He did very well in school. He was in secondary, he was straight A, sawa, except in Islamic religious education. Miskia. Isn't that interesting? All A's in everything except Islam. And then when he became a student at the University of Nairobi, he spent time with the wrong people. All right? So I want to say that friendships, relationships are important in radicalizing young people. And number 2, that religion, there is not a strong connection between religious observance and radicalization. All right? Also, all the evidence suggests that that poverty, all right, and broken families, or uhaba wababa, these things are not the primary factors that really shape someone to be an extremist or a terrorist. They are important, they are conditions, but because you are poor, most poor people, 45% of the population of this country is poor, and 45% of the population is not extremist or terrorist, is it? Poverty or social marginalization is a factor, but we can't say that it's the most important one. There are a number of factors, broken homes, ohaba wababa, and so forth. But you cannot say that if you find an individual who is poor, no father, poor education, and so forth, that person is going to end up being a terrorist. No one knows. No one knows really what it is that makes somebody decide finally that I'm going to plant a bomb in a bus out on Thika Road. No one knows that. All right, there are factors. But you really can't say that what it definitely is. This morning, I want to suggest to you that there are 4 aspects that we should pay attention to in how a young person, especially a young person, Muslim in Kenya, becomes an extremist or a radical. Number 1, I want to say that a young person in Kenya becomes an extremist or radical because he or she has a conscience. Usually we think of extremists and radicals as bloodthirsty madmen, lunatics. But I want to say that we should humanize them and begin to think that perhaps a person's conscience is offended when he or she looks around at what is happening in Kenya. I want to talk about a troubled conscience because somebody sees people being injured, a group like Muslims, and somebody has a conscience and says this is wrong. It's not mental illness or a broken home, but there are people do have a conscience and are upset by what is happening in this country. Second, I want to say that I believe the evidence that I have is that many Muslims, many young Muslims, see international global Islam under attack. They see themselves as part of a group of people, a world religion, that is under attack. In Iraq, in Palestine, in maybe in India, certainly in Myanmar, and other places, or southern Philippines. They see Muslim people being the object of attack by others. So they see Islam in Chechnya. They see in Bosnia. I mean, actually, there's a great deal of evidence, isn't there, that Muslims are under attack. And so a young person in Kenya, Muslim, would say, my religion, my people, the people I identify with are under attack. Number 3 in Kenya, I would say the personal experience of injury by the security police or in job discrimination. People actually do have experiences where the police target or profile Muslims. And they're, since, I would say since the mid-2000s, that there has been what's called preventive detention of Muslims and collective punishment of Muslims in this country. So someone who has a conscience, who thinks that Muslims around the world are under attack, looks at himself and says, I've had an experience like this, and I'm not going to put up with it. And finally, I don't want to say that ideology or theology is unimportant. I believe that there is a kind of a radical extremist ideology that is very current in the world and that attracts many, many people, especially young people, who are looking for some kind of an identity. All right? And for example, since you are teachers, one of the most important ways that young people are radicalized and become extremists, in addition to the friendships they have, is by the internet. Their personalities are actually shaped by their experience on Facebook, for example, where you develop your own personality. You create yourself as a human being. If you think that, I don't believe this. Here's an article from the front page of the New York Times, the most important paper in the United States, that describes the experience of a white Christian woman in part of the United States who felt lonely, didn't know what to do with her life, and through the internet made contact with ISIS became a Muslima, but there were no Muslims where she was. It was by the internet. But there she was. There was something in her life that was missing. And she developed a friendship, an identity. She went through a religious conversion, front page of the New York Times, on the internet. And this past week in the newspapers here in Kenya, 8 hours a day youth spend browsing terror sites. The internet, teachers, most of you, or you're not as old as I am, but you were, when your personality was not shaped by the internet or the mobile phone. Sawa? Maybe books or the mosque or education, but that's not how young people, and I mean people 25 and under, how their personalities are developed today. There was the revolution in Iran, and the United States and other Western countries decided as part of an international strategy to promote Saudi Arabia as the authentic voice of global Islam. That was a political decision that Western powers made after 1979. And that Saudi voice, the real voice of authentic Islam, really is a voice shaped by Hanbali and Wahhabi theology and law. That is not the type of theology and law that Islam in East Africa had. Most East Africans were of the Shafi'i school, which was really, you might say, open to adaptation and change. It was different from the Hanbali school. But because of a decision made by Western powers after 1979, Saudi Arabia promoted itself as the voice of Islam and offered many, many scholarships to East Africans, Muslims, to go study in Saudi Arabia. And in addition, the Saudi government sent large numbers of religious teachers to establish mosques and schools throughout East Africa, and to bring the Wahhabi and Hanbali message or interpretation of Islam. That was a big shift in East African Islam. And East African Islam, religious authorities, since the 1980s, there has been a conflict. A younger group of religious leaders influenced by Wahhabi and Hanbali ideas, and the older, established East African Muslim leadership, which is largely of the Shafi'i background. So there's a conflict in Islam, East African Islam. And some of the deaths of the sheikhs in Mombasa may come out of those internal conflicts between Muslims in this country. All right? Also, in 1980, you know that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and for the first time, Muslims defeated a Western, Russia as the representative of Western Christian civilization. They defeated them. That's the first Muslim victory, you can say, since the Turks, since we're in a Turkish school, defeated the British and the Australians at Gallipoli in the First World War. That was the first Muslim defeat of a major Western Christian army, and that meant a great deal to Muslim thinkers. That defeat of the representative of the Christian West led many Muslims throughout the world to ask themselves, well, what about the situation in Palestine? Or what about the situation in the southern Philippines? Or what about governments like the government in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, which was really an agent of the West? So Muslims began to think that they need not always be the losers in the war. All right, there was a change in the self-perception of Muslims throughout the world. And in addition, if you recall what I said earlier about the perception of Islam under attack, beginning in the 1990s with the breakup of Yugoslavia and what happened in Chechnya, and then what happened in the First and Second Gulf Wars, there was the perception that Islam was under attack by the West and Muslims had to make some sort of response. With that background, that global background of Muslim victory in Afghanistan and Islam under attack, what happened beginning around the year 2019, actually in 1998, Al-Qaeda began to establish small group cells here in East Africa. And my friends, prior to the bombing of the American embassy in August 1998, there is no history of Muslim extremist or violent activity in East Africa. There is none. Nothing like that. Nothing serious. It was something that was started by Al-Qaeda, and most of the people who were involved in the bombing of the American embassy in downtown Nairobi were foreigners. They were not Kenyans at all. All right? So, that began to change, however. So that when the attacks on the Israeli hotel took place in 2002, all the attackers, except one, were Kenyans. So in a 4-year period, we moved from Al-Qaeda cells to actual groups here in Kenya, inspired by Al-Qaeda, that decided to take up, violent acts against the government. All right? When that happened in 2002, the Kenyan government said that all of them who attacked the Israeli hotel in Mombasa were not Kenyans, they were foreigners. That there was no problem that Muslims had in this country. The government said there was no problem. The only one who said there was a problem was Chris Muungano, who said Kenya's war against terror will only be won by accepting that the problem exists. The government said Muslims had nothing to complain about. But Najib Balala said this: harassment and intimidation by the government, listen, have always been there for us. It was not something that happened after 1998. It had always been there. And now, he said, now we are already branded as second-class citizens because we are Muslims and Arabs. So the government said you didn't have a problem. You should be happy people, Muslims. What are you complaining about? But then there's Najib Balala, who said we've always been harassed and intimidated. And so beginning in the early 2000s, there were attacks on churches and businesses identified as Western or Christian. And so by the late 2011, 2012, there were Al-Shabaab attacks in Kenya that led to the invasion of Somalia in 2011. And then, you might as well say, all hell broke loose. There was increased radicalization. We really have to keep that in our mind. This process of Al-Qaeda planting cells, and then terrorism being taken on by a small group of Kenyans, all right? And the Kenyans who were attracted to violence were a strange group, all right? They were often of Somali background or Swahili background. Many of them were urban youth. They were slum dwellers who were Muslims who had no tribal identity. If they were Luya Muslims, they really weren't connected with anything Luya. They had a low standard of living, and you can study Muslim youth who became extremists and came out of Majengo slums in East